Today we're joined by Kieran McCarthy, who's here to discuss with us Cork's cityscape down through the ages. You're very welcome, Kieran.
Thanks, Sean.
I'd like to start by asking you what you think is the dominant architectural style in Cork City.
One of the things I want to say about Cork's architecture is that it's higgledy-piggledy. A very famous Cork writer way back in the 1910s, a man called Niall Toibin, wrote a book called The Threshold of Quay, and in his opening paragraph of this book, he talks about the higgledy-piggledy of the city. And if you look around Cork, the architecture is all over the place. We don't have rows of the same type of buildings. We've got different heights, different widths, different colours. What's the most distinctive feature? I would say kind of the limestone buildings and the sandstone buildings. The limestone came from limestone quarries on the south side of the city. The red sandstone comes from quarries on the north side of the city. And now the white limestone and the red sandstone give the Cork colours. Now we have very good examples of fantastic limestone buildings in the city. Buildings like the GPO on Oliver Plunkett Street, the Provincial Bank on the South Mall, the former Trustee Savings Bank on Laps Quay, the City Library facade and the Grand Parade. I suppose if you think of some of the church buildings we have in the city, Holy Trinity Church, like St.Mary's Church on Pope's Quay, which is another very fine example of a limestone building.
Are there any traces of the early settlements in Cork?
There are traces of, I suppose, the early monastic settlement in terms of St.Mary's Cathedral is still on the site. And St.Mary's Cathedral is the fifth known church on the site since the time of St. Finbar. The place names that survive from, for example, 800, 900 AD actually come from Viking Age times. And there is a lane called Kaiser's Hill, which marks a Viking Age settlement. Now, Kaiser is a Viking Age word. It means the path leading to the quayside. South Main Street, built originally by the Vikings, anytime between 820 and kind of 1000 AD.
And what are the oldest existing buildings in Cork?
The oldest buildings we have date from medieval times, that around the year kind of 1180, the Anglo-Normans took over the old Viking Age island and they put on an extension to that old Viking Age settlement, what's now North Main Street area, and you had a walled town across two islands. Now, in terms of what survives from the medieval town, there's two sections of the town wall on display to the general public. One is in Bishop Lucy Park. There's a section there about 10 metres in length by about 2 metres in the base. The second section is on display underneath Dunstore's multi-storey car park on North Main Street. There's a section there again about 10-15 metres in length. There is an argument that the archaeologists are making. The town wall around the southern island the Anglo-Normans had was limestone in nature. And the town wall around, we say, the northern island was red in nature. So you get this white and red kind of walled town. So when ships were coming up into the town during medieval times, they'd see the white and red. They'd see the Cork colours. Other kind of bits and pieces of medieval architecture, and we've got Red Abbey Tower. The Augustinians were invited into Cork around the year 1280 and they set up an abbey just off what's now present-day Douglas Street. The tower survives today. It's a fantastic medieval feature the city has. In terms of other kind of medieval features, a lovely castle from the 1560s on the grounds of Dundanion in Blackrock, which is called Dundanion Castle, and it was built originally by the Gallway family. Now, the Gallways were part of the parcel of medieval families that existed within the walled town. You had the Gallways, the Murrows, the Sarsfields, the Meads, the Roaches, and of course all these families had lands in the suburbs as well. And so the Gallways had lands in the southeastern suburbs, and still today there's a Gallways Lane in Douglas. And of course the base of Blackrock Castle is the original base of the castle dating back to the 1580s.
What's the most curious fragment of medieval Cork that has survived?
The most curious object has to be an old chimney piece. I suppose it's more post-medieval, more so than medieval, but way back in the 1970s, archaeologists from UCC were called to a site on the intersection of Adelaide Street and North Main Street, and they excavated 2 metres maybe down to the ground, and they found the chimney piece. Now, of course, the excavation went on and they found other kind of objects as well. Probably one of the most interesting finds discovered about Skiddy's tower house is that its foundations were tree trunks going down into the ground, that the whole thing was built on some sort of a medieval timber raft.
What would be the next major period of architecture after the medieval era?
It'd have to be the early 18th century, Sean. In the early 1700s in Cork, there was massive change. 10 years prior to 1700s. The city was attacked by a group of Irish rebels, supporters of King James II, and King William of Orange sent over a huge army to take the city back during the siege. And the walls of the city were damaged, and a lot of the housing in the city were damaged, the public buildings were damaged. And as the city moved forward into the early 1700s, it had to do enormous repair work. And as part of the repair work, actually the town walls came down. So the city began to expand to the west and the east. By 1750 was exporting 100,000 barrels of butter and 60,000 barrels of beef. So there was a lot of money to be made in Cork. And of course a lot of those wealthy merchants began to reinvest into the cityscape. New housing, new quays, marshes being reclaimed. A lot of the ideas in terms of reclaiming the land actually came from Holland. A lot of the travel writers in the mid-1700s, when they came into Cork, they talked about looking at buildings that had a Dutch style to them. So very narrow buildings, very, very tall. And of course, when you walk around some of Cork today, you'll actually still see some of these narrow and tall buildings. So, for example, on George's Quay, also very good examples of these early 18th century buildings. They date from the 1730s. There's one on Emmet Place. And there's also one just next to St. Mary's on Pope's Quay, which is now called Civic Trust House. There's not an enormous amount of 1700s buildings in the city because the Victorians had a field day tearing the 18th century city apart. Now, also around this time, Cork was known as one of the Venices of the North. The Venices of the North were a series of cities in Western Europe, places like St. Petersburg, Bruges, Amsterdam, Manchester, Hamburg, and places like Cork were part of this place branding exercise. Cork looked like a Venice, but unfortunately in the 1780s we filled in our canals, we arched them over, and we kind of created our principal streets. And on the South Mall you'll actually see steps leading up to buildings. And in the 18th century, because of the number of buildings that were being developed next to the canals, they had to make sure like their front living rooms weren't flooded out. So they put their front door up high. And the people who own those particular buildings, like steps leading up the front doors, and they still have permission today to moor ships outside their premises in their leases. And that's also a very exciting legacy of Cork's architecture from the past.
What's the most defining 18th century building that's still standing?
It has to be Shandon. Of all the buildings that have survived the test of time and is now kind of a tourist emblem for the city, it's St.Anne's Church, Shandon. It was built in 1722 to replace a building that was destroyed during the siege of Cork in 1690. The great thing about the tower is that two sides of the tower are limestone and two sides of the tower are sandstone, and the limestone faces towards the southern suburbs and the sandstone faces the northern suburbs. The sandstone itself came from a castle nearby called Shandon Castle, that's now marked by the Firk and Crane, and the limestone came from the Franciscan Abbey on the North Mall. It was part of a wider church building programme for the Protestant community in Cork in the early 1700s. Now, this church building programme was initiated by a man called Bishop.Peter Brown. And two other buildings as well in the city were revamped. Christchurch on South Main Street, which recently went through a €4.5 million revamp as well during the Celtic Tiger, and is now one of the city's finest concert venues. The second church that was revamped, which was on North Main Street, was St. Peter's Church. And also probably one of the most hidden churches that's just off Paul Street. Also developed in the early 1700s as part of Bishop Peter Brown's building programme, was called St. Paul's Church, and it's now a building that sells jackets, coats, but it was a sailor's church. If you came in on a ship into Cork and you had passed away on the voyage, you were buried on the grounds of St. Paul's Church.
And what impact did the Grand Tour have on Cork?
In the early 1800s, a lot of the wealthy people in Cork City and further afield in other kind of British towns and cities, they went abroad and they wanted to learn about other cultures. In particular, I suppose in Italy, Venice and Rome, they were two favourite places for British tourists to visit, and even Greek culture as well. And they brought a lot of these ideas back to places like Cork. And one of the things that emerged onto the cityscape in Cork, especially in the 1830s and 1840s, were these Roman temple-style buildings. So very good examples of that would be St.Patrick's Church on the Lower Road. St.Mary's Dominican Church on Pope's Quay. And a fantastic public building that the city has, and the foundation stone went in 1835, is the city courthouse. All those three buildings, St. Mary's, St. Patrick's, the courthouse, made out of limestone blocks.
And what about Burgess and the neo-Gothic movement?
William Burgess came to Cork as part of a church kind of rebuilding programme in the 1860s. The Protestant Cathedral of St. Finbar was being revamped. The Protestant community there were replacing a one-aisle church and had a spire on it. Something that if people passed this building, they were going to look at it and they were going to admire it. And a competition was set up to get an architect for this, the fifth known church on the site. If you entered the competition as an architect, you had to make sure there was going to be 700 seats in your church, and your total cost couldn't go over £15,000. Now, they got 68 entries into this competition, and there was one winner, a man from London, William Burgess. Originally, the cathedral was supposed to be made out of red sandstone, which is much easier to work with, but he changed to white limestone, which is a harder rock to work with, so the cost went up. And also William Burgess never took into account he'd actually have to employ masons. So by 1890, the total cost of the cathedral was £100,000. He died actually before he saw the spires put in place. Before he died, he gave a gift to the cathedral of a golden angel. Now, the golden angel is a legend attached to it, that if the angel blows his trumpet 3 times, or falls off, or turns green, the world is supposed to come to an end. When the Catholic community in the city saw St. Finbar's Cathedral going up, they also put plans into place to revamp St. Mary's and St. Anne's, the Catholic North Cathedral. Unfortunately, they weren't as successful in terms of fundraising to put in giant spires and fantastic architectural features. So if you ever look at St. Mary's and St. Anne's North Cathedral today, it is a very, very fine building, but it doesn't have as much kind of embellishments as you see on the outside or even interior of St. Finbar's Cathedral. And of course, one of the other fantastic Catholic churches that went up in the 1860s was St.Peter and Paul's Church. The foundation stone of that particular Catholic church went in 1859. It was built to replace a smaller Catholic chapel on the site. And it was driven by a Dr. John Murphy, a son of one of the founders of Murphy's Brewery in Blackpool. Edward Welby Pugin was chosen to be the architect. He was the son of a very famous English architect called Augustus Pugin. Edward used a lot of his father's ideas, high spires, neo-Gothic styles. Some of the confessional boxes were carved by the D family, wood carvers in Cork, and some of them were carved by the Quay family, who are from Louvain in Belgium. If you look at the marble within the building itself, the red marble came from a little island, the green marble from Gallway, and then there's Sicilian marble from Italy, because the building replaced a chapel on the site. In fact, if you ever stand on the outside of the building and look up the front of it, there's a lot of unfinished pieces to it. There's a section for 1 or 2 statues, and the statues aren't there. They didn't have the money at the time. It's just after the time of the Great Famine. And also there was supposed to be a spire. So they actually had to lower the height of the spire for financial reasons and also for structural reasons. And today all you see is a little minaret.
This brings us closer to modern times and the Victorian era. Can you tell us about the feel of the city at that time?
It was a typical British city. On one class scale, you had a wealthy class who were making a lot of money from this kind of butter and beef boom, and they were kind of investing money into streetscapes and public buildings, everything from kind of elegant banks to churches. And on the other side of the scale, then, a lower class, they're living in slum conditions. So we're talking with the bones of 60, 70,000 people living in diabolical conditions. A myriad of old laneways, falling down country cottages. And a lot of these images can actually be seen in some of the city's paintings in the Crawford Art Gallery, which was actually one of the public buildings that emerged in 1885. The Crawford family gave money towards an art gallery in the city. And also during the 18th century and the 19th century, you've got a series of middle-class terraces emerging in places like Sundayswell, Montenotte and St. Luke's. So there was a big contrast between rich and poor.
Is it true that the longest and tallest buildings were both in Cork?
In terms of the longest building in Ireland, that would be, I suppose, the former Cork Lunatic Asylum that was built in the 1850s. It became known as Our Lady's Hospital and now has a series of apartments in it. It's probably the one building in Cork that's under massive threat at the moment in terms of trying to preserve it and trying to find a way forward for it. Another institutional building, the Good Shepherd Convent, former Magdalen Asylum, recently burnt down. So some of the older buildings and some of the great buildings we have in the city are actually under threat, and they're vacant buildings, and we need to do something with them. Across the way, of course, from the former Cork Lunatic Asylum, Our Lady's Hospital, is County Hall. When it was built in 1968, 1969, it was the tallest building in Ireland, surpassed in recent times by the Elysian Tower.
Despite recent redevelopments, Patrick Street looks architecturally different on each side of the street. Why does one side seem more Victorian and the other more 20th century?
December 1920, half of our main street, St.Patrick Street, was actually burned down during a reprisal attack by the Black and Tans, and also burnt out the Carnegie Library, the public library in the city, and also City Hall. The City Hall building had been built in 1890. And the city had to rebuild half its main street. Late 1920s, early 1930s styles began to emerge. As you roll on through time, the architecture in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s was very much characterised by the expansion of suburban housing. Places like Turner's Cross, Grona 1950s, places like Churchfield, the Loch began to be built. 1960s, 1970s, a flat culture being built. Places like Toker, Mahon, Mayfield, Knocknaheeny, Hollyhill. So if someone came, I suppose, forward in a time machine from the 1700s, one of the big things that they would have seen is the suburbs being built on. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happening to the city is a depopulation of the city centre. People are actually moving out further out into the suburbs and moving out of the city into these housing estates that the Celtic Tiger created. And of course, probably one of the greatest kind of symbols of the Celtic Tiger economy in Cork, of course, is the Elysian Tower. 21st century Cork is also marked by a boundary extension, the first since 1965. On the 1st of June 2019, the city took in an extra 80,000 people, so bringing its population to around 210,000, and also increasing the city's area up to 5 times. Coupled with the population expansion, the city's skyline actually continues to change, and is very much evidenced by the pace of development in the city's docks, as the Port of Cork moves its services down the harbour to Enniskillen. And I suppose the city is just going through another phase of its kind of evolution. We talked about the evolution through medieval times in the 18th century and the 19th century. We're now entering into another phase of kind of Cork's evolution as we kind of go further into the 21st century.
Thanks, Kieran, for this very interesting tour of Cork's architecture.
No problem, it was a pleasure.